much as I can all the time, and if I'm not playing, I'm usually thinking, dreaming about it, looking at my stats in school, showing it to my friends, telling them my guild stories, you know.
Well, virtual reality, you can be who you want to be, and you can be where you want to be, and with whom you want to be.
I couldn't physically pull myself away from the console.
Okay, we're away.
Yeah.
So
Here we are.
yeah, welcome to both of you. It's great to talk to both of you about this. I'm glad you both agreed to do this. I know this was kind of my idea, but it's all three of us sat here talking. So, Adam, Aaron, great to be talking to you both again.
Yeah, it's good. It's nice that we're all talking in the same place at the same time as well. It's believe the first time we've all had a discussion like this together. So, yeah,
it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, lots to talk about. But so, I mean, what if we'd like to tell the audience what it is we're going to be discussing today?
Well, okay. I mean, this all kicked off because I initially suggested doing a roundtable discussion, and it was all about this story about the British film director Duncan Jones, also known as Zowie Bowie, David Bowie's son.
Yeah.
Who has recently signed on to make a film version of the computer game World of Warcraft. And we kind of were bouncing emails back and forth about computer games, films, associated stuff. And so we thought, let's just have a roundtable discussion and invite everyone else in on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I mean, I personally haven't played a lot of video games personally, but I've done a fair bit of research into video games, in the background of video games, things like that. I mean, I think you guys would probably... Tom, I think you said that there was a game that you were quite into for a while.
I am a bit of a gamer, or at least I have been in the past.
Right.
Gamer, to be honest, as an adolescent. I certainly... had games consoles and played computer games a fair bit. Wasted, a reasonable amount of my teenage years doing that.
Yeah, I'm in that same boat, but I'd say I was even younger. I'd say like middle school to high school age. I was to video games pretty heavy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I probably a bit different. I played like the Sega Master System 2 when I was young. I think it was about like 6, 7 to maybe 10, 11, 12 at the very latest. And then I remember the PlayStation came out, and there was like Gran Turismo, but I never really owned the only console I ever owned was just the Sega. I never took it any further than that. Any other experience in video games has just been casual here and there. Maybe a friend's got a console type thing. Apart from one other experience that I did have, where I got into a particular video game a few years ago and found the experience to be highly disturbing, which I'll get into later on. So I probably have less experience than both of you in terms of actually playing video games, but I've done a lot of research into the background of video games. So yeah.
So what do you make of this guy, either of you, this guy Duncan Jones? Because I think, his two previous big films that we know about were Moon, which was 2009, and Source Code, which is, well, they're both films with an awful lot of ideas going on in them, and not particularly pleasant ideas, I'd say, in either of them. So either one of you want to jump in on the films that he's made before?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'll talk about Moon real quick. It was basically just about cloning, and it was an exploration of some of the downfalls of cloning. And that was, if we want to break down the movie as quick as we can, I guess that would be it, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's about a guy working on the moon to he's extracting fuel from the surface of the moon and kind of
he's strip mining the whole moon, basically.
Yeah, and posting it back to Earth. And then he discovers, as the film progresses, that he's in fact a clone, and he's whatever the 20 iteration of this same person working on their own on the moon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's basically it. That's the story. That's right there. That's the whole film, basically. But yeah, it's still very important themes, though. Yeah, and of course, what was the other one that you mentioned?
Source Code.
Source Code. Yeah, that is another very interesting film dealing with a lot of interesting concepts, especially relating to the military-industrial complex and their, shall we say, experiments into. Well, I mean, this whole film was based around the experiments into quantum physics, basically, and yeah, I mean, it's kind of a complex. Well, not overly complex, but one would have to watch the film, and I'd be going off on a tangent if I were to explain the entire, sort of plot of the film right now.
No, sure.
It's not really...
I think for this particular conversation, the important bit about that film is that it kind of portrays the military-industrial complex as effectively omniscient. They can find out almost anything they want, even if it means kind of injecting one person's consciousness into another dead person's consciousness just before they get killed, or whatever the hell it is that they're actually supposedly doing in this film. Yeah. But that's the idea, I think.
And of course, it's necessary too, because they're preventing a terrorist plot, a terrorist bomb, a dirty nuclear bomb from blowing up Chicago. So we've got to have these programs. We've got to keep you all safe. Mm-hmm. So yeah, of course.
Yeah, so they're sort of acting like God, but at the same time they're doing so in everybody's best interest. So they're a benevolent God.
And that's why they're mixing people's consciousness together and stealing other people's identities and so on through quantum physics. Yeah, it's all for our own good.
Yeah, it's all for our own good, of course. Everything's always for our own good, including video games, apparently. Because if you actually do, if you do a Google search, for example, just take some keywords like video games, mental health, depression, addiction, things like that. If you just do sort of random Google search on those sort of key combinations of words, and basically looking at the negative impacts of video games, what you'll find is just basically a whole bunch of studies that talk about how great video games are and how video games can help you, and video games have been helping to treat everything from troops suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder to people with attention deficit disorder, which is completely seems counterintuitive because I think video games are more responsible for causing...
increase that?
Yeah. But basically the impression one would get if one was to do a Google search, on these types of subjects is that, basically video games are actually quite good for you psychologically. And
yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've come across these things. Yeah, and then the general idea is that, yes, they're good. They're not bad, and it's, you would think buried in there somewhere, or at least it should actually be on the top, that we'd have an issue with video games causing problems with addiction, because clearly they are very addictive.
I think as computer games have got more sophisticated, as the environments that people are playing in have become more sophisticated and more immersive, and you can do more things in them, that has only made them more and more addictive, because they provide you with sort of even more than just, you're not just kind of playing football on a football pitch or basketball or whatever, skating around or something. You're, in effect, living an entire life within the game. And this is particularly true, as you were telling me, with World of Warcraft, which is not a game I'm particularly familiar with, but I've kind of been learning a bit about it as we've been chatting about it. So yeah, I think the fact that this guy Duncan Jones is making a film about this doesn't strike me as a coincidence, shall we say?
Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon, the whole World of Warcraft thing. And as I said before, I've never personally played it myself, although I have seen other people play it, and I've seen the addictive effects and the consequences of addiction on people that I've known, and it's been quite scary, actually. I've seen people quit their jobs, become, start eating, way too much and becoming really unhealthy to the point of hospitalization, and complete depression, complete social isolation, I mean, it's always, of course, whenever the media does any type of focus on World of Warcraft and stuff, they predominantly at least tend to focus on all the positive aspects and how, oh, look at this couple, they met through World of Warcraft and end up getting married, and and look at all these happy people at the gaming convention centers, and they're all playing together, and they're all meeting people who they've known online for years, and they feel as if they're closer they're closer to these people than they are to their family, and look at all the great things that World of Warcraft has done for people on a social level. That tends to be the predominant conclusion that's drawn from so many of these media articles and documentaries and whatnot, and it sort of ties back to what I was saying before about if someone were to do a Google search on the different studies that have been done on the psychological effect of video games, they're predominantly presented as being positive. They're predominantly be presented as being something that's good for you, basically good for your brain, good for your relationships, good for you socially, good for you, and in so many other ways. So yeah,
it's funny you're saying that if you really get into the World of Warcraft and you become addictive, you become socially isolated. But the argument against that and for World of Warcraft being good would be, hey, look, it's an online community and people do interact with each other. They can chat and you're actually interacting with the other players. So it does a good job of simulating a real life social environment, and it becomes an alternative to a real life social environment. And people, for whatever reason, like the addictive quality of video games added onto that, it becomes better for certain people, and that's why they end up spending all their time in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, though, the important question that's always running through my mind with that one is which is cause and which is effect. Is it that the person was tending towards social isolation and therefore looking for some other social platform to be a part of, and therefore turned to World of Warcraft or Facebook or one of the other slightly more, shall we say, basic forms of online communities? Or is it that because they got involved with that, they became more socially isolated? And I think it will tend to be, not always, but it will tend to be people who were already somewhat isolated, somewhat socially dysfunctional, or just not that good at, socializing with other people, and therefore they were looking for another forum. And because they found this one, and because in this they could kind of pretend that they were whatever they wanted to be, and they could tell anyone else anything that they wanted them to hear, that's much easier. So that then isolates them yet further. That's probably the trajectory, I think, of most people who get involved with this, would you say? I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing here.
I think you're probably right. I think it's probably a degree of that, definitely. I mean, people of that type of, shall we say, socially, maladjusted personality types are always going to be prone towards, looking for other solutions or alternatives, in the form of virtual worlds and virtual environments and, social media platforms like Facebook and, multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft and things like that. So I think that's definitely going to be true to a degree. But I think the question you were sort of raising before is, which one is the how should I put it, the predominant factor here? I think both of them feed back into each other. I think one will feed the other. I think the more this whole community and the more this whole phenomenon grows, the more it will draw people who might not otherwise have been drawn into it in.
Yeah,
so
that's what the hope is too for virtual worlds, just in general. That all the promoters for them, the Kurzweil, the Matteo Keikes, all these guys, they're like, oh yeah, everybody's just gonna be living in these things in 20 years' time. So, of course we can analyze who's using them now, and it's sort of a more extreme sort of person, I guess we'll just say. But the idea is for everybody to be in these things.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that opens up a whole other can of worms. Well, a whole other side to this, which is the history of video games, and tie into the whole military-industrial intelligence complex, and there are so many different references and facts to look at in that area. But I think it would probably be good to look at those later on, in the conversation, because it'd be nice to discuss the social phenomenon, or to look at this as a social phenomenon, at least in the earlier parts of the discussion, and why it's become so popular, and what types of effects it's having on the society around us.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Let's loop back to that a bit later on. But I think you're absolutely right, Aaron, when you say that the aim here is that this is for everyone, not just because of statements by Kurzweil and films like The Matrix and what have you, promoting, the digital identity and digital reality and us all living as part of some kind of computer or whatever. But in particular, that we have this computer game being made into a presumably quite high-budget, popular film.
Yeah.
That is a big red flag to me. This is one of the reasons why this news story kind of jumped out at me, was I was thinking most computer game to film conversions, adaptations, have been terrible, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like Mortal Kombat, yeah.
And Mario Brothers is awful.
Street Fighter, yeah, pretty much all of them have been awful movies, and most of them haven't done well at the box office either. So it's not like this is a project that, or a genre of movie that's been very successful, yet they seem to be determined to stick with it. So why are they sticking with it, and why in particular have they moved on from something like Street Fighter, which has a relatively, or Mario Brothers, which has a relatively straightforward movie format? You have your heroes and you have a scenario that they have to somehow resolve or whatever. I mean, how on earth are they going to make a film about World of Warcraft? I
imagine something akin to Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like what the World of Warcraft setting is, in a way. They take all the same fantasy type themes, dragons and witches and monsters and demons and all that kind of stuff, and the World of Warcraft settings. I mean, there's a number of different worlds you can go into in that, or parts of of an environment you can go into, but they all sort of resemble that sort of almost Tolkien-like, environment. So there's definitely a close relationship between the two. And I don't know enough about this new project with Duncan Jones, but I'd imagine, rather than it being sort of a real story about a man who starts playing World of Warcraft, it's going to be like a fictional retelling of an actual story within that environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if the movie's good enough, it will get attention to the game itself and get more people interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying this is all set in a essentially medieval setting?
Well, a fantastical medieval setting is so with fantasy. It's like the what is that TV show, the Game of Thrones? You're watching it. It's almost like it's a period piece for the medieval times, and then they throw in a dragon baby. And it's like, okay, there's dragon babies here now, whatever.
Yeah, it's sort of like Lord of the Rings kind of meets Harry Potter meets, like pretty much every other fantasy type, genre or, drama series, out there really. It's sort of like an amalgamation of all the key fantasy themes, wizards and witches and, monsters and demons and dragons and kings and kingdoms and warriors and, all that type of stuff. Yeah. So as I said, I haven't actually played the game, but I have seen, a lot of gameplay and I've looked into it. So it's definitely very much akin to things like Lord of the Rings, which has been, immensely popular, especially the films,
Well, that's what's so interesting to me about this, is that I would have thought if you were going to try and sell people a alternative digital reality, a sort of, Second Life. I mean, there is a game called Second Life, but you know what I mean. That if you were going to sell them that kind of thing, that would you not be best kind of replicating the high-tech modernist futurism, the kind of ideal consumerist society, if you like, and try and funnel them into that. But instead, what they're doing is offering them, like you say, sort of magic and pixies and dragons and things. And I find that curious, because it's sort of atavistic. It's a throwback. almost.
Yeah, it seems to be counterintuitive in many ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, that it's offering you a digital reality. Well, I suppose that's kind of the con, though, isn't it? They're offering you a digital reality that is a more natural, in big inverted commas, society.
Yeah.
A Garden of Eden or something like that. Is that what's going on here?
Well, I think in many ways, I think it's the perfect escape, from the world. It's especially for the as I said, the perhaps maladjusted, personality type, someone who, finds that they need to have some kind of escape and uncomfortable socializing in the real world. This is a perfect escape for them, where they can create an avatar / identity, in this virtual environment and become completely immersed in it, to the point where, the involvement in this virtual environment becomes more real to them than actual real reality does. And that is going to be very appealing to a lot of people for a number of reasons. And I think as, time progresses and as, certain agendas in the geopolitical realm are played out and, life becomes more and more difficult and confusing for the average person, the whole concept of being able to escape into some other virtual reality where, they're in control, or at least have more control and can do the things that they're unable to do in the real world is going to become ever more appealing to people who may not have been otherwise prone to, those types of games, and it's not just World of Warcraft. There are so many other examples of this idea, being promoted through other corporations. And I mean, even IBM, for example, have been using Second Life to actually be a platform for a lot of their business meetings. There was a documentary done by Douglas Rushkoff on the PBS network. He did a whole series of them, but I think one of his more recent ones was I can't remember the name. It was like Digital something or other, or Digital World, or Digital Life, or I can't remember the name of it, but Digital Nation it was called. If people want to look that up, it's a very good documentary. In that, he basically goes around documenting the different projects that are being undertaken by various corporations, think tanks, universities, and other institutions, where the whole concept of a virtual environment is actually overtaking the concept of a real working environment. So employees for big companies like IBM are actually doing a lot of their having their conferences and their meetings and planning their strategies and doing what they would normally do in an office in an online virtual setting, such as Second Life.
Yeah, there's a lot of selling points to the virtual conferences, definitely. And for replacing standard travel with virtual meetups. And for one thing, you don't have to pay for a flight. You don't have to get on the flight. It takes no time. It's instantaneous. And I'd also add that it's very good for your carbon footprint.
That's just what I was thinking when you said that.
Well, they did mention that in the film. They mentioned that very fact. They said how much money that these companies would be saving on travel for their various employees around the world. They'd be saving so much money on travel because they can literally just get everyone to log into Second Life and go and sit around a virtual table with their headphones and their microphones, and they can be on a beach, or they can be in some fancy restaurant or whatever it is in this virtual world, rather than actually flying people around the world. And of course, as you say, ties perfectly into the whole idea of just carbon emissions and the whole greening agenda, shall we say.
Well, and I think another selling point that just occurred to me is that there's no climate change in World of Warcraft within that world itself, because, of course, it's a completely controlled, programmed environment. So it has that appeal, if you like, on top of the real world appeal of low carbon footprint.
Yeah, well, it's an environment that can totally be tweaked even by the user. So it has that customizability, and that's, again, the appeal and part of the addictive quality to it, is that it can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, and that is going to be that is the massive selling point, for so many of these games that are coming out now. It's the perfect escape. It's the perfect vice for people who have trouble adjusting and socializing in the real world. They're presented with an ability to as I said before, create virtual identities for themselves. They can. There's that famous clip of Ray Kurzweil that you featured in your film, Aaron, where he's talking about how I've always wanted to be a woman, and he talks about how in virtual reality, he can become. He's got this alter ego, a woman, and he can basically design what she looks like and choose what clothes she wears and choose how she comes across, and he can sort of walk around and interact as a woman.
And as freaky deaky as Kurzweil may be, that came off as very not genuine to me. So I don't think he really did want to be a woman. I think he's just selling the idea to other people who may want that. Yeah.
I think there's probably some truth to that, and we could debate whether that's whether Ray Kurzweil was actually being honest when he said that. But again, it doesn't matter. It's still going to be used to sell that whole idea to people who generally do want that.
Well, and isn't this a guy who's also trying to resurrect his dead father in some sort of digital format or something?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think there's clearly some issues there.
Well, and he clearly has some odd things going on inside his head that he's not really in control of. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
So the three groups we've kind of outlined so far that would be attracted to not just World of Warcraft, but the sort of the digital replication, the digital reality in general, are, if you like, social misfits of some sort, people in favour of the green movement, people who believe in the whole carbon nonsense, and people looking for a enhanced kind of consumerism, a ultimate customizability of their own life, if you like.
Yeah, that's it to a T. Yeah.
There are a couple of other groups that it struck me could also be potentially kind of tied into this if this thing continues to be successful. On the one hand, you have drugged out hippies, I would say, and on the other hand, you have sincerely religious folk. And I know those two are actually quite similar in a lot of respects, but I just wonder if either of you had any kind of input on that and the way that it potentially is being sold to either one of those two demographics.
No, I hadn't really considered that particular aspect of it because, I guess, in terms of religious people, the only kind of connection I've seen between, people who have very strong religious views and the whole concept of virtual environments and gaming and all that stuff is mainly been in a military context where you've got these patriotic, sort of almost Bible Belt type Americans who are basically raised on, first-person shooter video games and thus become recruited by the military because they've been, basically raised to, fire without thinking, to push a button and to kill, a target or an object without thinking. And that again is brought out very well in the film that I referenced earlier, Digital Nation by Douglas Rushkoff, where he actually interviews one of these drone pilots, and based out of one of the military bases in Nevada, and they were basically talking about how was he worried that perhaps this disconnect between him and the actual business end of what he was doing in terms of him being based in America yet flying a drone that's actually flying around in Afghanistan or Iraq and killing people. They sort of asked him, do you ever feel worried or anxious or guilty about the fact that you may have been responsible for the deaths of innocent people, having been so disconnected from what you're actually doing? And he just says no, I'm absolutely sure. I get good intel and I trust my commanders. And I've got my faith in God, and God. I know that God's helping me here, and God gives me the strength to do the right thing. And so in terms of like a religious tie-in, I think that would be the only thing that I've noticed. But there could be plenty of other angles to take on that. Did you have any input on that one, Aaron Doyle?
No, not on the religious aspect. I guess with the sort of hippie or even drug culture, I'll just say that video games can have a psychedelic quality, and the concept of a virtual reality is very psychedelic in its nature. It wouldn't surprise me that the same crowd that sort of promoted drug use would kind of jump in on this too.
Yeah, that I think that's to be expected, or at least something to kind of keep an eye out for, because I've not really seen that yet, but I kind of have a feeling it might be coming. And I mean, for me, the most obvious connection is the rise in certainly American teen TV and teen movies of the kind of stoner character, the stoner.
Yeah.
You see this. There's a pair of them called Badger and Skinny Pete in Breaking Bad.
Oh yeah,
and they are basically guys who sit around taking drugs and playing computer games. That's what they're doing, just kind of wasting their lives away doing that. And I think there is just a straightforward correlation there between people who are kind of listless and bored and uninspired in their lives, and so they, whatever, sit around smoking drugs or something. And what's the easiest entertainment that's available? Well, it's the happy buttons plugged into the PlayStation. So
that's actually that's a very good, very pertinent observation, because that's, I mean, I guess I didn't really think about it in terms of the drug happy culture, but at the same time, I definitely noticed it in my own life, in my own experiences and observations, in terms of talking to most. It seems to me that at least maybe it's not like this everywhere, but so many people I've met, especially mostly males between the age of, shall we say, anywhere between about 12 and 40. So many of them. I don't know. I don't want to give a percentage because I'd be guessing. But it seems like the majority of people, in terms of at least the sort of middle to working classes, are quite content to live that kind of lifestyle. And I mean, most people I talk to on the street, I talk to at work, or I talk to, in passing, or I get into any kind of conversation with, do live the lifestyle that Tom has just outlined there, where basically they will work a menial job that they don't really like or enjoy, and they don't really have any higher aspirations in life, but are quite happy to just simply go home at the end of a shift and get stoned and play some kind of video game. And a lot of them spend most of their lives doing this. That's basically it. It's work. Take some drugs and play some video games and just sort of and do that for an entire night or an entire weekend or whatever it may be. It's a very predominant cultural trend that I'm seeing. So I would definitely see that myself, just purely from an observational point of view.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's staggering to me just how normal this sort of behavior is, and just how prevalent drug use is. That's just been a thing throughout my life that I've been kind of surprised by. I'm like, man, almost everybody is addicted to some sort of substance or another. It's crazy, but games are just another substance, but they're not labeled as such, and it's flying under the radar now. But they're certainly, I think they're just as addictive as actual substances, and all they are is interactive environments, and they're seemingly completely separate from you, but they're not separate from you because of the way that they interact with you psychologically.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lack of understanding of what the psyche and what consciousness and all that actually is that gets us into the problem of defining this as a real addictive substance, even though it's not a substance,
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. And this ties back in with one of the little notes that I jotted down before this conversation, which I wanted to ask you about, and that was whether or not Facebook is a gateway drug for World of Warcraft and such like.
I think Facebook is a gateway drug for just about everything in terms of the digital world and the whole concept of virtual reality. To put it bluntly, really, I think. I mean, if you look at the rise of Facebook, I mean, basically, first you had a few of these smaller social platforms, like you had Bebo, and then MySpace was a bit more popular. And there's a number of other ones sort of for younger people, sort of like 9 to 15-year-olds or whatever. But then I remember so vividly how Facebook was immediately promoted and overcame and totally, basically took over that entire social media market within the space of about 2 years. And of course, we later found out a year or two later that this was because they'd received approximately $14 million in financing from a CIA front company. That's another conversation altogether. But I mean, it's quite incredible how quickly Facebook became the norm and the standard for basically everyone. I mean, I don't know anyone who isn't on Facebook apart from myself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's definitely in many ways a gateway to further immersion in digital worlds and digital environments, and also into the transhuman project or agenda, shall we say?
Yeah, I definitely found it suspicious that Facebook was promoted the way it was, and then kind of came out of nowhere. That was odd.
Yeah, well, I mean, lots of money, lots of financing, lots of good strategy from people who know what they're doing.
And a big budget Hollywood movie, kind of like I'd expect.
I think the big budget Hollywood movie was more of a basically. I think that was
celebration. It was a celebration after the fact.
Yeah, and I think it was a cover story as well. It was to reinforce the idea that, oh, look, Facebook was just created by one of these geniuses like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. It was just some kid at university who just had some amazing insight and revelation and just developed some world-changing, revolutionary computer platform all by himself, and it's just become a world phenomenon thanks to his genius, and it was all about him. When okay, sure, he may have developed the actual coding and the software platform for this, but I mean, getting that, to taking that and then looking at how popular Facebook is now in terms of it literally being the standard for almost everyone in the world. I mean, as I said before, I don't know anyone who isn't on Facebook apart from myself. I mean, it's like that requires a lot of money and a lot of planning, a lot of strategizing, a hell of a lot of marketing and promotion, and that can only come from people who've got who've got experience in those areas, such as people like Peter Thiel from PayPal, who donated a lot of money, and of course these CIA front company, which was Excel Partners, a venture capital firm that CIA runs to basically influence and control the technology markets. So it's quite staggering how quickly Facebook completely overtook all of these other social platforms and became a worldwide phenomenon in the space of a few short years.
Well, and particularly when you look at who it was competing against, because when Facebook started to come around, that was the point at which MySpace, big corporate backing, it was no small website, was MySpace.
Well, that was Fox. Well, the Fox Corp. It was either one of, I can't remember what was Fox itself. It was either News Corp or Fox. It was one of Rupert Murdoch's.
It was part of that whole circle of companies. Yeah. So you wouldn't have thought they were an easy competitor to go up against, but they've completely blown them out of the water. Now MySpace it's a website that doesn't really work. It doesn't. Yeah. I don't know why it still exists. I don't know why they still have it online. But the whole thing is kind of an embarrassment to News Corp or to Rupert Murdoch, whoever it is that's involved with it. So
well, who knows? A deal could have been struck. You never know.
That's kind of what I'm driving at. That at some point along the line, there seems to have been a choice where MySpace was ditched, and Facebook. They decided no, Facebook is what we prefer, what we want people to use.
Yeah, absolutely.
They could always bring back MySpace in a new, improved version. Maybe they'll have a virtual reality on there, and that'll bring everybody back to MySpace. I don't know.
I tend towards thinking that this is more likely to amalgamate systems rather than create new separate systems in terms of social media. I think if you look at like the way that technology has developed over the last few years, especially in terms of things like smartphones and tablets and things like that. I mean, they all come built in basically, like with Facebook apps and Google apps and all this type of stuff. So all these companies are working together to try and amalgamate all of their systems into one basically easy to use platform. In so many different ways. But I think it's more likely that they'll choose to amalgamate things rather than set up new alternatives. But who knows? Who knows?
I think you're broadly right, Adam. I agree with you, because the number of websites you see where it says you can log in via your Facebook account. I don't want to log into every website on the internet using my Facebook account. Why on earth would I want to do that? But it seems that that's one of the ways in which it's become a standard, that you can actually log into lots of other people's websites in order to comment or like or whatever it is that you can do through your having this one centralized Facebook account. And they're also trying to merge, they've merged Google plus
Google as well,
as well. And so you see all that. But the flip side of it is exactly what we were just discussing, that a few years ago we would have said that about MySpace, and then along came Facebook, which was a competitor. It was something different, if you like.
Yeah.
So we don't know. I'm saying I know it's broadly heading in that direction, but you never know.
So people love the next big thing, and they like being a part of it. I can see big time with the whole Instagram thing. So I'm not sure if you're up on this, but Facebook seems to be being pushed out by Instagram, or at least people think it is. And people just seem to love replacing the old thing with the next new thing, and that lends itself to being able to easily introduce new ideas and new platforms, and be it a virtual reality platform, that would certainly be the next new thing, and it'd be easy to introduce because people want the next new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't used Instagram. I don't know a hell of a lot about it, but I have heard of it, and I'm hearing it constantly being referenced by people in terms of social media. And yeah, I mean, people are always obsessed with the new thing. I mean, it's like, I talk to so many people, always promoting whatever the latest thing is. Like, you had that Google Wave thing a couple of years ago. You've now got, and there's so many of these little like social media type applications and platforms that are just constantly coming out, and every single one of them that ever comes out, people just jump on board straight away without a moment's thought about what the implications or the consequences might be. It's quite staggering, really, when you look at it.
That always blows me away, just that effect and people's reaction. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everyone. I mean, literally, like, as soon as, Google or Facebook or YouTube or whatever, or Instagram or whatever the platform or the company may be, as soon as they release some new function, some new app or some new kind of social media platform or some way of, some sort of social media based, system, or, basically most of them are just novelties, really. They're just sort of, altered versions of what already exists. But, as soon as one of those is released, it's like everyone's inviting you to them, and, everyone's on them, and everyone's talking about how great it is and how convenient it is, and how, it saved them time on this, and how now we can do this and we can do that, but we couldn't do it before. And it's quite, as I said before, it is quite amazing how pretty much, as I said before with Facebook, it's like basically everyone I know will just, literally sign up for these things and go along with them and, start using them as the moment they become available to the general public,
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned it before, the integration of Google Plus, which is their own sort of in-house social network that they're trying to build up.
Yeah,
the integration of that with YouTube, which you can actually break. If you look this up, how can you keep your YouTube account and get rid of the Google Plus half that they've just added on without your permission? There are ways of doing that. So, yeah. But it it doesn't even work very well, because now all the comments and everything, all the things that you would normally just get under your YouTube account, is now been transferred over to your Google Plus account that you never even asked for. So now when someone comments on one of your videos, it sort of appears in your Google Plus alerts or something, and I'm just I never wanted any of this. I was perfectly happy with being able to log into YouTube and click on comments and read the comments. I was fine with that. There was no need for any of this, but clearly they wanted to integrate those, and they're trying to turn the whole thing into a social media platform rather than a video sharing website. So
absolutely, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it's not about what the user wants. It's about what the big company or whatever organization it is that's bringing you that service is what they want to do with it and what they want you to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, which is basically give up more and more and more and more of your personal information and aggregate it, and then aggregate as much of that information for them as rather than them having to aggregate it themselves.
Well, of course, none of us paid for any of these services. None of us paid to use Facebook or YouTube or Skype or anything. They're all free at the point of use. They're all free, but what you're actually giving up, what you're actually paying, is, like you say, your privacy.
Exactly. You always pay. You'll always pay for any of these so-called free services. People just jump on them. Oh, it's free. It must be great. I mean, I'm always suspicious of anything that's given out for free. But it's people don't think about the fact that because they're not paying for it monetarily, it doesn't mean that they're not giving away something or letting something go or basically. Not suffering, shall we say, but, basically paying for it, in some way, as you said before, with a lessened sense of privacy, and that's always the case with all of these things. I mean, pretty much every one of these applications or new types of platforms or new devices, they're getting cheaper and cheaper. They're getting more and more convenient and easier to use. Everything's becoming integrated, and people think that this is a great thing. But what they don't realize is that with every step forward in this direction, they're actually giving away more and more of their privacy and having less and less freedom to decide what information they do and do not share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, with big corporations and governments, no less.
Well, looping back round to YouTube, the last thing I wanted to talk about was this mental video of, I mean, what was the title of it? It was Greatest Freak Out Ever or something.
Yeah.
And basically it's a lad popping a camera up in his brother's bedroom and telling the camera that his brother's totally freaking out because someone's deleted his World of Warcraft account, his identity and avatar and all of that on World of Warcraft. And then the kid runs out of the room, the brother comes into the room and completely flips out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I suppose, as we were just talking about, Adam, off air, is this thing real? I suppose my first question is do you feel that this is authentic or not?
Well, I don't know. That's the thing. I mean, it could be, it could not be. It could have been staged. Some of the things that particular young man did in the video were very, very disturbing, and I begin to wonder whether something to that degree could have been staged. Would they have actually voluntarily gone and done some of the things that he did, especially the part towards the end of the clip where he's lying on the bed trying to basically insert a remote control up his rectum, I mean, that's pretty disturbing stuff, and one has to wonder whether that has been deliberately staged, but on the other hand, it's almost as if, for me anyway, it's not so much whether that particular video itself was in fact real, but the concept of whether those types of things happen, which I'm sure they do, whether or not that video is real, I'm quite confident that these types of freakouts, do occur quite on a fairly regular basis with people. Because I've seen it in my own life with people I've known for example, I used to know a guy, who was in his 50s. He had a teenage daughter who was about 15, and she basically got addicted to Second Life to the point where she stopped going to school. She locked herself in her room. She refused to come out. Any attempt at communication, she'd become extremely angry and extremely emotional, very, very aggressive. She stopped eating, all that kind of stuff. She started stealing her parents' credit cards to buy things on Second Life, and it got to the point where she actually had to be taken to a hypnotherapist. So, I mean, whether or not that particular video on YouTube, which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will have been familiar with, and it can be found, I can't remember what the title is, but, whether or not that particular one is real, I mean, we know that this type of thing does go on, the fallout from being immersed in a virtual environment is quite staggering on the whole.
It's definitely a real phenomenon, and one, as we said before, that gets played down and people tend to want to ignore it. I'm not sure why, but it's not recognized yet. And anytime it is recognized, it's in a comedic fashion. Even this video is kind of known as a comedy video and a funny video, oh, did you see this latest funny video? So it's always brought up as something funny.
I
think you're absolutely right. I mean, I found that video, the first time I watched it, I thought it was authentic. I'll say that much. I'm less certain now, having watched some other videos in that series that are all based around the same family. I think some of those videos are certainly staged, but other ones seem more real. So it's hard to say. But when I first watched it, I did find it quite disturbing. I certainly didn't find it funny.
No. And that, I think that ties right into the whole cultural desensitization phenomena that we're seeing, which I believe is, maybe not primarily, but, partly a result of video games, combined with, basically Hollywood and the way Hollywood's going in terms of their output, where people are becoming completely desensitized to things that would otherwise be quite disturbing. I mean, if you look at so many of these videos on YouTube of people people getting, of horrific things happening to people, like people getting caught in really bad accidents and being really, really badly hurt, or people, whatever it may be, people are actually getting to the point now where they're actually laughing and getting pleasure from watching other people suffer, real suffering, and that I think, ties right back to the whole concept again of desensitization. The individual's loss of their ability to basically differentiate between virtual environments and virtual worlds and the real world. So I think I think that really reflects a general social trend in many ways, and in terms of especially the younger generations,
It's definitely been an online trend for a while, just these sites that have like the worst sort of violence and actual sexual content they'll throw on there too, and they'll mix the two together. And, just any sort of extreme video you can think of is all popped onto one site. Yeah. And then for me, the problem becomes one of association. People start associating all these bizarre activities with one another, and they don't realize how they're warping their minds, but it absolutely does.
No, sure. When you have the image of the sort of horrifically damaged body that's been run over by a train or something, and then next to that you have 10 world's sexiest cheerleaders or something.
Yeah.
And, and
exactly.
And they wonder why serial killers start carving up cheerleaders. I mean,
the
association is being made for people, whether they or not.
And they wonder why people, will go onto YouTube and see someone, or go on one of these video sites, and it's actually like, a real footage of someone being killed in a horrific manner, and they'll laugh. And I've seen this. I've seen people, I've actually witnessed people, in real time, people I used to know sitting down on a computer, they're saying, "Oh, check out this, it's hilarious," and it's like a 4-year-old child being, literally obliterated by a really fast train, like being smashed to pieces, and they're laughing. They're laughing. They think it's funny,
Like Alex from Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, exactly. They're actually getting a sense of enjoyment out of watching this stuff, and so it is. Again, I think I really do put this down to the effect that the virtual world, video games, and the media have had on people's ability to differentiate between reality and fantasy, basically.
There's a phenomena that I think Jeffrey Grubb coined called dark ecstasy, which describes this perfectly, is when people derive some sick sort of pleasure out of seeing or doing terrible things. Dark ecstasy, and it's a pretty interesting concept. It's definitely a real phenomenon.
Well, it's kind of like what Freud referred to as the thanatos instinct, the death instinct, and that's a very deep psychological concept, and people have argued about this for generations now, but it's basically the shadow personality and the dark side. You've got eros, the life instinct, and you've got thanatos, the death instinct. And so you've got these two polarizing sides of the person, or these two polar sides of the personality. One which has a drive toward life, towards regeneration, towards creation, towards beauty, towards positive things in general, nourishment, exactly, all the positive things, and then we have the shadow, which is that sort of part in the depths of our souls that's prone towards death and darkness and destruction, and exists within each of us, and I think that thanatos instinct, as Freud called it, is being brought out and trivialized at the same time as being exaggerated by all of this, all of this online content, especially video games and all of these, YouTube videos we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And to tie back in with what you were saying before, to me, it's fundamentally about divorcing people from their most natural emotions, because that's what you have to do in order to convince them that a digital life is better.
Absolutely.
You have to convince them that actually having less sensitivity towards other people, having less consideration for the world around you, having less sort of attachment to your own nature and to, like I say, the nature of the world around you, that is all. That's all absolutely fundamental to getting people to accept and embrace the digital life.
Absolutely, and we can see that in so many areas. We can see that in so many areas. If you look around at magazines and advertising, TVs, pop culture, films, music. I mean, that idea that you've just outlined there, and this whole decay of any sense of compassion for the fellow man or for the society you live in, and concern for the future of people and of yourself. And this obviously doesn't apply to everyone, but we can definitely see that. It's definitely there. It's and again, it's quite a scary phenomenon when you really think about it and look at it.
Yeah, the surprising thing to me is that all this keeps flying under the radar and that nobody talks about it. It blows my. I don't understand that. It doesn't make any sense.
I think it's because really, and I think we'll get into this maybe in the second part of the discussion, is because this is part of what I believe, and I think what you'd both probably agree to some level at least, would to be a larger agenda to, like as Tom says, embrace this new digital reality and to embrace a lifestyle and an existence that is far more digital and surreal and fantastical and sort of base in many ways as well than real reality, and so any argument or any kind of data or statistics that would seem to suggest that this type of content is damaging, addictive, mentally unhealthy, or whatever it may be in some way, is going to be minimized by big interests who would rather push the idea that this stuff is healthy for you. And that goes right back to what I said at the beginning of the conversation, where if you Google for studies on the effects of things like video games on mental health and video game addiction and things like that, most of the papers that have come up, at least initially in the first couple of pages of your Google search, are basically papers that conclude that video games are healthy for you, that they're good for you, that they can increase your intellectual capacity, that they can de-stress you, that they can be used for so many different psychological and emotional applications. So I think
the question that they're never really asking is, are these people who are using computer games and digital life as some sort of medical practice? The question that's never asked is, are they actually just taking vulnerable people and feeding them into the machine? Whether they realize it or not, I think that is what they're actually doing.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I mean, as I said, I think I mentioned this briefly earlier on. I mean, the military. One of the many ways in which the military has been developing and doing research and studies into this area of games and virtual environments has been the treatment of soldiers for post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, that's always been promoted as being, oh well, wow, it's a way that you can heal someone. We can take these patients through a series of online sort of simulations or exercises that will basically begin to desensitize them to certain stimuli, and thus basically begin to inhibit the symptoms of PTSD, by sort of creating a disconnect between the real experiences and the real memories they've had and the virtual treatment programs they go through, so that the memory is actually transformed into something that may or may not have happened. It's transformed into a sort of a fantasy virtual thing in their head. It's kind of hard to describe, but again,
it's very dreamlike. It's like they're designing dreams. Yeah.
So surrealistic. Yeah, definitely.
Well, and what that then reminds me of is a little bit in source code, which we were talking about at the top of the show, where you have this traumatized, effectively dead soldier who is being experimented on, and his handler, the female soldier who's sort of talking to him, she walks him through a series of mental puzzles in order to kind of rejig his mind and get him back on mission. And she does this repeatedly throughout the film. And that's very, very similar to what it just struck me as very similar to what you were describing, Adam.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, there are some sort of studies that have been done into the negative effects of games upon mental health and upon people's psychology, their emotions and their relationships and things like that. But they're so few and far between compared to all the studies that say, oh, video games are great, and so that ties back to the whole idea of it being a bigger agenda to familiarize and normalize the concept of virtual worlds and video games and virtual realities, and making people become to accept them more than they otherwise would. But There's a few. There's a few. I mean, there's a project called like the Daedalus Project that was run by, I think, an ex-gamer who did a number of different studies on all types of things. And people can go to that at it's www.nickyee.com /Daedalus. And basically, there's a whole bunch of polls and research papers and sort of opinion pieces on basically it's called the subtitle of the project is called The Psychology of MMORPGs, which is massively multiplayer online real player games. So. I think I got the acronym right anyway. But there are some out there, but again, few and far between compared to all these studies that say, oh, it's so great, and it's it's basically just it's a solution for so many things in so many different ways.
Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap things up for this time, because a lot of this stuff is stuff we're going to have to get into in the following episode and flesh out in a bit more detail, particularly the military and intelligence connection to all of this, which, again, links back to World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
So unless either of you two, well, do you have anything you'd just like to polish off with, throw out your websites or anything?
Well, I mean, I'll just throw in my website. I mean, as I said, as I've been saying in other interviews, it's basically just a holding page, which I'm, trying to develop right now. It's www.cerebralrevolt.com. I used to be involved with the Glasgow Truth Group, and although that is still technically running and may continue for some time, I'm sort of going off on my own and doing my own stuff now with this website. So if people want to bookmark that and check back in, a month or two, there's going to be, content, and I'll be uploading stuff to it, and I'll be developing it into something that I want it to be. But Tom, your websites?
Yeah, I'm at investigatingtheterror.com and spyculture.com. You can find all of my stuff at either one or both of those websites.
And Aaron?
I'm Aaron Franz. My website is ageoftransitions.com. Lots of material there. Check it out.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see the audience in the next hour, where we delve deeper into the military-industrial intelligence connections to the whole world of video gaming and online social media and all of that. I hope people enjoyed the first hour.
So do I.
As I can all the time, and if I'm not playing, I'm usually thinking, dreaming about it, looking at my stats in school, showing it to my friends, telling them my guild stories,
Well, virtual reality, you can be who you want to be, and you can be where you want to be, and with whom you want to be.
Physically pull myself away from the console.
Hello, I am Aaron Front of theageoftransitions.com. Here with me today is Tom Secker of investigatingtheterror.com and also spyculture.com. We also have Adam of cerebralrevolt.com. All of us are here to have a group discussion about video games in virtual worlds, their emergence in our real world, and the sort of problems that arise with video games, the sort of problems that aren't being talked about, at least not enough. So we all are getting together to talk about video game addiction and the like. So
if you haven't listened to the first part of this series, this is the second part, so be sure to go back and listen to part 1. And we talked a little bit about video game addiction. And with that, I want to say hello to both of you, Tom and Adam, and what do you have to say about this new episode here?
Well, hi everyone. It's good to be back with you both, and I'm sure this is going to be another interesting hour. Yeah, I mean, as I said, people should listen to the first hour really, and sort of consider some of the points that we're trying to get across in that first hour, because we'll be touching again on that, and then looking at some of the other aspects of this whole phenomenon, such as the connection to the military-industrial complex, which is a it's a big long conversation. Put it that way. There's plenty of information there to be discussed. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. What about you, Tom?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think we did a pretty good job in the first hour of looking at the sociological and psychological impact of video games, and more broadly just the digital life. And I did like the way that we went into some depth on how all these things are potential gateways to what would ultimately be the digital replication of human consciousness, the giving up of physical existence and becoming digital entities. And so, people should go back and listen to that, and particularly have a mind to. We kind of went through the different kinds of people who are likely to be enticed into this, and I think that is certainly worth people listening to and having a think about how that affects their own life. And it's great to be talking to you both again. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, we're talking about virtual worlds here, virtual reality as the alternative to real life. And we actually have the people who are developing these technologies are pitching this as, something better than real life in a lot of different ways. I know we talked a little bit about Second Life, but you have the creator of that whole program very emphatic about the whole thing, and he's kind of saying that, as opposed to what we said last time, how these are sort of decaying people's ability to have actual relationships with one another, he says it's enhancing it.
Yeah, it's nourishing it. It's making it better. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That was his angle, definitely, for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, what do we do in the face of this? Because if we bring up the subject, it's a taboo now. People don't recognize that there is such a thing as video game addiction, let alone that we should even talk about it or how we could. So what do we do about people kind of saying, hey, look, this is a non-issue. In fact, video games are wonderful.
Yeah, well, it's a hard question to deal with. I mean, it really is, because as we talked about in the first hour, and again, I'll reiterate the same basic kind of concept that I was trying to get across was, the general impression that one is given through the mainstream media on the subject of video games is that, they're basically okay, and that, there's all these different applications for them psychologically and for education and psychological development and even, healing and all kinds of different things. But it's only very, very occasionally that you will ever see a solid counter argument being at least aired or put forth in any sort of mainstream media platform or channel, to the whole concept of video games being good for you. It's very, very rare. I mean, there's a few documentaries out there that do sort of ask some of the harder questions and try and dig a little bit deeper. Digital Nation by Douglas Rushkoff is one of them, which I'd recommend. There's a few other sort of mini documentaries. BBC Panorama did a sort of a half hour focused on this once as well, so people can look those up. But apart from these very small examples, it's like you were saying, it's the whole idea is that these things are just great, and it's just not the case, it really isn't. I mean, the fallout from this stuff is incredible, and I've experienced it myself.
Exactly. Yeah, you have. I know I have too. I just, from playing video games, I think anybody who's played video games just knows inherently they are addictive. I mean, if you're honest with yourself, you can see that it has the addictive quality to it. And that's just common sense to me. So part of this is we're ignoring our common sense and our intuition and just our feelings about things that are kind of quite plain and simple. It's confounded by what we're told over and over again, or what's omitted from the official story. But what's your experience with it, Adam?
Well, as I said in the previous show, I had sort of, like a basic Sega console when I was young, and I pretty much grew out of all that stuff by the time I was about maybe 10, 12, the latest, and that was really it. But then again, about, I don't know, maybe I think between 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, I was flatting with somebody who was a really avid gamer. He had all the the full, like, every console that was out there, and big television and home stereo system and all the rest of it, and home cinema, the whole deal, and stacks of games and everything. And I didn't really have much interest in it, but to be honest, there was one situation where I got around to, playing just one of the free demo games, I think, that comes with the Xbox 360, which is called Trials. And it's basically a fairly simple game. It's basically, you're just maneuvering like a motorcycle through these, obstacles and doing jumps and, trying to get your time as low as it can be. And, it's kind of like a rally cross for, motocross for bikes, basically. And there's, all these different tracks and, all, the difficulty obviously increases as you progress, etc., like any game. And, it was a lot of fun. I got into it and I got really, really into it really, really quickly. All of a sudden, for having not played any games for years and years and years, I found myself getting actually quite addicted to this game. And it got to the point where I was doing, sort of like 12, 14-hour marathons of the game. And I had an experience once where I'd been doing one of these marathons on the game, I'd been playing it for, basically, I don't know how long. It could have been anywhere between 8 and 14, 16 hours, something stupid, And I went to bed, afterwards, and I had basically what amounted to a lucid nightmare, really, is the best way I can describe it. I actually thought, I had a nightmare where I actually thought that I was in the game and I was writing this game, and it was actually, it was so real. It was, if people have experienced lucid dreaming, they'll know how real it feels. It's almost indistinguishable from reality, from consciousness, from waking consciousness. And I had this experience, where I was actually in the game, and I crashed the bike, and the bike erupted in flames, and I was trapped under some structure or something, and I could see and feel and smell like my whole body erupting in flames. And at that point I just screamed and woke myself up, So, it was it was the body's reaction to, getting yourself out of that situation. People who've had nightmares or sleep paralysis will be pretty familiar with this. I've had sleep paralysis before as well. And basically the way to get out of it is to yell as loud as you can to wake yourself up. You can't move physically, but you yell to wake yourself up, and that's basically what I did.
I know
it. My flatmate, the guy who actually got the console, had said to me, he also commented a number of times, he said, I've heard you yelling out, like screaming out in your sleep a number of times now, and it's actually really freaked me out. He said the screams were, pretty disturbing, You're just right out in the middle of the night. And this is all around the time I started playing this video game. And after that experience, that was it. I was like, no thanks. No more of that.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Horror.
That was a pretty scary experience. And we would look at these videos on YouTube where, the one we were talking about last time, where the guy, the little kid gets his World of Warcraft account deleted and has a complete freak out. Whether that is true, that video itself is real or not, it doesn't matter, because this stuff is going on. It really is. I've experienced it myself just from being into a game for a few weeks. And imagine the impact it's having on people who are playing this stuff year in, year out, like literally their whole lives as they grow up, And some of these documentaries I mentioned before, you can see clips on YouTube. There's tons of them actually, Obviously, they're not mainstream media clips, but you will see these little sort of mini focuses, or maybe sort of like a local TV station doing a focus on some kid who's just totally lost his mind altogether from playing video games. Literally, he's totally lost the plot. He's not in reality anymore. He's not a natural, normal, functional human being.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Adam. And I did watch some of those clips that you sent round. You sent round links to. Excuse me. But one thing I did notice is that in all of these news clips, and particularly in the BBC Panorama documentary, is that this was often being framed not in terms of what I thought was the most profound impact on these people's lives, which is that they were becoming socially alienated and socially incapable, but it was that their grades were suffering, their education was suffering,
exactly.
They weren't getting on in their education and their career and their the life narrative that they were supposed to have. And the focus wasn't really on the fact that none of them had girlfriends, none of them had any interest in finding a girlfriend, none of them were really developing the friendships that they already had. I mean, that was what they were really losing, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, it was all, they weren't getting the grades that they were last semester. And I'm kind of like, well, I can kind of see why, if that's what people are being told, that, that's what you're sacrificing by doing this, they'd just think, oh, well, what the hell? I'm not sacrificing that much. Whereas if you emphasize to people that what they're really sacrificing, what they're really losing, I think you'd get through to more people. And I think these pieces would have more impact and more effect. I mean, what do you think?
I totally agree, absolutely, and it's a shame that there isn't more of it around in terms of mainstream coverage. They actually do ask some of these more profound psychological and social questions regarding the impact of video games, especially on developing people. People who are in their formative years, basically, whether that be from age 5, age 5 to 20, age 5 to 25. 30, whatever you want to call formative years, it's having an impact on you the whole time. So I mean, I think that's probably deliberately spun that way, though. I mean, especially with the BBC, the whole narrative here, as we discussed, is basically to present video games as being a positive thing. And so if you're gonna critique them, then make sure you critique them in such a way that you can. It's not going to do the long-term agenda any damage. It's like okay, well, it's causing some issues with grades, but so what we'll need to do is just improve the video games and make them a bit different, make them less addictive and more educational, and that's that problem solved.
Rather than any fundamental rethink of what's going on.
Exactly. I think that's probably the angle that I'll probably play there on that one.
You're absolutely right about the formative years and kids playing these things, and it does shape who they will be. And me, being a father, I look at things in a different way, and I see these pieces, and it makes me think, okay, what's my son like? How's this going to affect him? Because obviously it will. With virtual worlds, video games, and all that, it's just going to be something that I'm going to have to deal with, that he's going to have to deal with, because even now he's not even a year old, but if he gets a hold of a tablet or a cell phone, his face lights up. It really does. Yeah. I mean, you should see it. It's amazing. It's like, oh my goodness, this is like the look of pure joy on his face, and then he starts touching the screen and moving it, and he knows what he's doing. So I mean, obviously. It's something that we all have to deal with now.
Just the way computers looked 10 years ago, the average operating system, be it Microsoft or Mac, and then look like an iPad or an iPhone works. It's almost like a kid's toy. It's got big, flashy, big, colorful buttons. That you can just swipe.
It is. It's a kid's toy. Absolutely right.
It's like a toy. It's like a kid's toy. And so it's going to be so. I mean, and there's a bit of a bit of childhood in all of us, so to speak, and so we all, feel sort of attracted and fascinated by these things to a degree. But I mean, especially for kids, the stuff that Apple's been putting out, and the whole touchscreen technology, and all the simplicity of it all, and the sort of the moving things around with your fingers, and I mean that is absolutely perfect for kids, absolutely perfect.
And there are also educational initiatives to bring tablets and all these things into the educational process. I mean, this is something that's literally happening. It's like government initiatives that are, and as adults, it's easy to lose track of that sort of thing, I think.
Well, it's because I think the whole. I mean, I just remember growing up, just the whole consensus. Whether it be in the media, or whether it be family members or people you spoke to on the street or whatever, the whole consensus was that computers are great. Computers are great for education. Computers are great for teaching kids, and kids have got to have computers these days. And you've got to get your kid a laptop so they can learn on the internet and do they were definitely promoted very heavily as educational tools and must-haves. For people when the personal computing era started in the mainstream.
It's even more so today.
Absolutely,
more so.
It's even more so. It's just growing, especially with the release of all these touchscreen technologies and especially the stuff that Apple puts out. I mean, don't get me wrong, I use that as well, but I mean, it's you can see it's you can see how the sort of the simplification and the reduction of the operating system and the way it functions down to its most basic sort of sensory level in terms of touching boxes and moving them around with your hands has been designed to draw a younger and younger generation into the world of computing and virtual environments and games and the whole thing.
Yeah. Now we're talking about the sort of human-centered interface. What are your thoughts on this, Tom? The interface changing like that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that they've infantilized it. They've made it much more childlike and much more child-friendly. But also, I mean, I recently, as in literally a few days ago, got given a tablet as an early birthday present. And I have been kind of playing around with it and seeing what it's capable of. And I admit I did go and have a look at what games were available for this tablet. And one I noticed, which I thought was absolutely chilling, was a game whereby the objective is basically to infect humanity with a virus. So you have to chemically develop a virus and then release it. That seemed to be the purpose of the game. So, yeah, that's a rather gross and horrible indication of where all this is going. But
and where it's come from, too.
And absolutely, in terms of a eugenicist angle. But the thing that particularly bothered me about the way the Android operating system works is that it has very little customizability. There's very little you can actually do to make it function in a different way. And even Windows, you can do quite a lot to just make it function more quickly to do certain things, or you can turn quite a lot of stuff off very easily and just say you don't need any of that. With the Android operating system, that has so far proven virtually impossible. Basically, you have the options, which are, like you say, the big flashy buttons. You either push that one or that one. But apart from that, you can't really do anything else. So although we've discussed in the first hour how one of the ways these things are being sold to people is the sort of infinite customizability and the ability to express your individuality through technology, in reality, these things aren't very customizable. They're actually extremely uniform. They're extremely almost military and regimented in the way that they work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's for the integration of all the different applications and programs and, all the different, that ties, of course, into all the different surveillance programs and all the rest of it, I mean, obviously that's going to be the way it's going to go, considering, the objectives that, the military, industrial and corporate, whatever complex you want to call it, this whole Leviathan, that's behind video games, is going to want to happen. So, it's all about integration, really.
It's another thing that people will take for granted as well, because the interface will determine all your interactions with everything on that tablet or what have you. If the interface is limited, that creates the entire structure for this virtual world, if you will. And that, again, everything is being taken for granted. And as you're mentioning here, military-industrial complex, I think if you even bring up that term to anybody and try to relate it to this, especially, they'll be like, "What are you talking about? This came from Steve Jobs. I don't know what you mean."
Yeah. What people don't realize, though, is the military were developing all kinds of different programs. They were basically giving funds out to the top universities and think tanks right across the states. A whole bunch of different programs running right from the 1960s in terms of how they could use technology, things like virtual environments, and sort of simulated situations to train soldiers, and basically through that, series of, experiments and research, R&D projects, basically, the video game ended up being, the game where, you're pushing keys on a keyboard, or, now it's, joysticks and controls, but, the whole concept of, the single player or multiplayer video game was actually a result of, long-term, studies funded by the military, into how they could train soldiers better, and so, of course, that now has become, there's a basic, a tie into all the first-person shooter games, that started coming out in the 90s, that were basically developed by the military for training soldiers, and then were sold off to the private sector.
Yeah, so they used those game engines to make commercial entertainment products. Yeah,
there you go. Yeah, they're one and the same, really, the commercial and the military. And I have another little life story here too, if we want to hear it. I live here in Southern California, where the military-industrial complex thrives. There's many different, you got your Boeings, your Raytheons, and Northrop Grummons. Those buildings are just peppered all across LA County. And then you also have big game developers here too. Yeah. So I know somebody who has worked at a game developer for, I won't say the specific one even, I don't think it's even matters really, but it's one of the games that is quite obviously a military game where, one of those games where you are a soldier, first-person shooter, massive multiplayer aspect to it too. So he would work on that game basically, and he told me that military officials would come into the office and that they'd kind of like check in and just like consult and things like that. So I mean there it is. They do come in to the video game as part of the development. They come into the office.
Huh. I think this is basically just the the residue of a long-standing relationship. I mean, there was a research paper done by a bunch of I think it was I'm sure it was a German couple or a German family. It was Renate and Rudi Hansel did a paper. I forgot the name of it, but they were basically, they basically studied, the links between the military-industrial complex, especially the army as well, and basically video game, companies. And there's one of the quotes I took down from the document. It was they basically were saying. During the 90s, the killing simulators employed for hand-to-hand combat in the U.S. Army and Police were released by the Pentagon to be sold for private use on the public markets. As a consequence, the computer and video game industry that had cooperated with the Pentagon from the very beginning boomed. Since then, the so-called killer games have wreaked havoc among children and youths. So that's one of the few studies that actually, has gone into the actual real background of where these games have come from and what kind of effect they're having on, today's, population, especially the younger generation, the youth,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'd also, if you do find resistance with people saying, oh, no, this hasn't got anything to do with anything, this isn't real, this connection, I'd also point people at a first-person shooter that's actually made by the Army, by their own in-house software crew.
Oh, yeah.
Called America's Army, and you can download this for free. I haven't played it. I watched a couple of minutes of it on YouTube just to make sure it was the sort of game that we're talking about here. And yeah, it's a first-person strategic shooter, and it's all about glorifying the military. And this is used both for recruitment purposes and actually for training. It's used for both.
Yeah.
And even when I was kind of having a bit of a flick around reading about this, I found that there is actually a spin-off comic, like a graphic novel comic, that you can download that is based on this game and likewise is used for recruitment purposes and propaganda purposes. Mm-hmm. And I read the first issue of this today, and it's like the worst war film you've ever seen. It's so thin and disguised. It's not even disguised. It's just kind of openly propagandistic, and it's all about going into some country because there's some humanitarian disaster with some horrendous dictator with an Eastern European name that has to be taken out, blah 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 blah. And yeah, when I was reading about this, I came across an interview with someone from Comic-Con, the big comic conference, saying that there were representatives of the Department of Defense actually turning up there promoting this thing and trying to recruit computer nerds and recruit comics nerds as part of this whole process. And that, I think, is absolutely fascinating, because if you think they're not the sort of people the military would normally be reaching out to. They're really not. They're the sorts of people who genuinely want to kind of hide away in their bedrooms playing computers their whole life. They're not going to join the army.
Eating pizza and smoking cigarettes, and not getting any sleep.
Guys who, if they went in the army, they'd just get pummeled. But instead, now we have them even reaching out to them, which I think is really crossing a threshold, culturally speaking, from, instead of recruiting the jocks, they're now recruiting the nerds as well, if you like.
Well, I think part of that is probably just not even for perhaps actual physical military operations, but perhaps for more like intelligence related espionage and surveillance operations.
Well,
I mean.
Drone piloting,
for drone piloting, and of course, even just simple things like that. The story that came out last week about how the Edward Snowden released documentation about the CIA, FBI, and NSA all infiltrating Second Life and World of Warcraft, A, to spy and surveil supposed terrorists who they believe to be communicating through these games, and B, to actually recruit insiders from the games to collect information and report back to them on them.
Yeah, you know what's funny? This leads you to think the classic internet troll that leaves all those idiotic and terrible comments all over online. These people are probably, or could be, kind of like the ideal recruit for certain jobs like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these people who, basically just, I don't know how to describe the personality type, but, the chip on the shoulder personality type who will basically, align themselves with whatever radical cause, they find, they find a sort of amicable and fulfilling at the time, will just go around, just slacking people on the internet and telling them that they're wrong and that they're superior and they're more intelligent. I mean, there is a demographic out there that exists that are like that. So
they get pleasure out of denigrating others and doing it not face to face, but like from far away through computers. That adds a whole nother bizarre element and quality to this. And it's an element of the virtual world that we're all coming to begin to understand. But at the same time, I think it deserves to be noted that the military is likely far ahead of us in understanding, the psychological phenomena at play here. That would be my assumption, at least.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about, is the infiltration of what it says in this Snowden leaked document was GVEs, games and virtual environments. The infiltration of that, I didn't really need a Snowden document in order to tell me that was going on. But what I do wonder about is what is their ultimate purpose here, or even their immediate purpose, because as it says in this document, it's all about terrorism, but that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what kind of Al-Qaeda cell or whatever so-called terrorist you might talk about would meet up in World of Warcraft? I mean, seriously? And even if they did blow it up, it's only pixels anyway. So I'm left wondering, what is that a smokescreen for? Because terrorism is the catch-all excuse for absolutely everything that the military-industrial complex is doing these days. I get that, of course, but what is it that they're really gaining from it? Because I understand black operations in the real world. I understand them exactly what they get out of that, what they get out of false flag terrorism or whatever. But what do they really get out of this?
Good question.
I mean, you have to speculate, but I'm kind of asking for your speculation.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of that, the infiltrating games for, to supposedly, track the movements and communications of terrorists. I mean, obviously, I don't really buy that whole, the war on terror thing, and a lot of other people don't. I think it's greatly exaggerated and used to advance other agendas. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. But I mean, when I just look back to, for example, that document that Snowden released recently from the NSA. Basically, there's a quote there where they say GVEs are an opportunity. We can use games for C&E exploits. I'm not sure what C&E stands for. Tom, do you know what that stands for?
I am not sure. Let me have a look at the carry on and I'll have a look at the document.
Yeah, it says C&E exploits, social network analysis, human targeting. That's human targeting. So it's human intelligence targeting, obviously. ID tracking, photos, document IDs, shaping activities, geolocation of targets, and collection of communications. And then it goes on to say it has been well documented that terrorists are OPSEC and tech savvy and are only getting more so over time. Blah, 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 terrorism. And then they finish off by saying, through targeting buddiest and interaction found in the gaming and on gaming websites, social networks can be diagrammed and previously unknown signals, intelligence leads, and connections and terrorists to cells discovered. GVs can contain online presence indicators, geolocation, and ID tracking can be gleaned and used in apprehension operations. So again, they're throwing the whole terrorist thing, but really, I think, for the rest of us and for the majority of this program, is used for, just basically general day-to-day surveillance of everybody, really, as, has been exposed recently by people like Edward Snowden, although, he's not the first one. I mean, he's just reiterating a whole bunch of stuff that people have been saying for years. And, I have my own thoughts about him, and that's another conversation altogether.
Yeah, we've all got our doubts about Edward Snowden.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Aaron? What do you think is their kind of ultimate purpose here? What is it that they're getting out of this?
Well, I do like the point we're making about the terrorism, because anything that is being hoisted upon us as part of whatever agenda we want to talk about is framed in this safety and security context. And again, you get the terrorism scare in here, like, ooh, the terrorists, you know all about them, don't you? Well, we got to deal with them, and we got to deal with them in every single facet of life. And lo and behold, this whole virtual world concept is a burgeoning reality. It's something that we're all being told that, well, it's here in one sense, but it's certainly coming even to a greater extent to a home near you. So you're going to be living with all this. And again, this is the ultimate point that's made in every single documentary you're going to watch on the subject. You'll find that it always ends with somebody saying more or less that, okay,
it's happening.
It's happening.
Yeah.
This is the future, like it or not, we're going to have to deal with it. So, I mean, we're being told from all angles that this is happening. This virtual world thing is coming. And it is, to an extent, here already. And that's fascinating, too.
Well, and going back to what we were talking about before in the evolution of the way in which we interact with these electronic devices, another thing that occurs to me is that whereas it used to be you'd have probably a keyboard or some very simple gamepad, you'd be clicking buttons, you'd be doing something where there was clearly a mechanical interface between you and the machine, whereas now it's your movements themselves. Whether it's
you are the controller.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whether you're talking about the Microsoft Kinect thing where you dance around and then your little guy on the screen dances around, or whether you're talking about a tablet where you're flicking your fingers around on it and actually physically touching it yourself and it's responding directly, you're more directly involved in the physical process of actually controlling the computer. And I suppose, the mouse was an early incarnation of that, and the joypad, and then you get the joysticks and what have you. And now, like I say, it's your actual physical motions themselves that are the controlling mechanism.
Mm-hmm. The marketing reflects this. The marketing rejoices in this too. It's like, look at how cool this is. You're the controller now. Whoa! And, that's me just being childish. But I mean, they talk to us like children in this material, and we react like children. I think you hit on that point before. There's a child in all of this, so we react to these things.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just look into the homes of so many people these days. I mean, the video game is no longer something that the teenager or the child plays. It's something that is often enjoyed by the whole family. And I've seen this in a number of different scenarios. Where the whole gaming console, be it like what's that one where you've got the guitar and the drums? It's like
Rock Band.
Rock band, and like a lot of the famous, like rock guitarists have got on board with it and done promos for it and stuff. I think it's called something different over here in the UK, but
I know Ringo Starr did a promotion for that game. They had a Beatles version of it, actually, I believe, a few years back.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same game. I think it's just called something different in the UK. But there's there's been so many different guitarists and musicians to get on board, basically to promote this stuff and just talk about how great it is that we're moving the world of music into the digital realm and allowing people who otherwise weren't so musical to now take up, some kind of musical instrument practice, whether it be guitar or drums or whatever, something like that, and I found it to be, I've played it before, and I've found it to be the most unmusical, most unenjoyable thing I've ever done, considering the fact, I play the guitar, so, and I used to play the drums, and so I play it for real, and to me, going and playing one of these games is just horrible, it sucks, there's no joy there at all. It's just like, it's like playing Spaceys or something like that, it's just.
I've got to be honest, my feeling is slightly different. I quite enjoyed playing Guitar Hero, but only when I was
Guitar Hero, that's it, Guitar Hero.
But only when I was really drunk. Only when I was too drunk to play the guitar properly myself, because I play the guitar really well, and I know exactly what you mean. I always looked on it with that kind of skepticism, but I have to admit, late in the night.
Well, maybe I should get drunk and play it then.
But yeah, I mean, like I say, only if I was too drunk to play the actual guitar would I really enjoy Guitar Hero that much. And again, it's this infantilization, because if you think about it, it's one of those staple toys that you get for young children, is a little bleepy guitar or a little simple keyboard or something that a kid can play and can get a bit of fun out of, and maybe see if they've got any musical talent in there somewhere. And they're always sold as, this will help your child's education, and you might be able to, they'll then learn a proper instrument and all of this. But now we've got 30, 35, 40-year-old men picking up the little plastic guitars, and if you told them that in any other context, they would say, no, that's ridiculous, that's a kid's toy. But somehow it's sold to them. Somehow they've just missed that facet of it.
And I've seen guys over 50, getting right into this stuff, like seriously playing it, like on a regular basis,
were they mostly burnt out old rockers or what?
Kind of, I guess. Yeah, I guess there was a couple of the individuals I'm thinking about could possibly be described as guys that kind of burnt out rockers that never learned to play an instrument and really regretted it. But hey, here comes this game, and so here's your last chance. But it's not musical. It's rigid. It's almost like it's all about your reaction time. And it's all about you responding to pre-programmed stimuli.
It's as musical as Space Invaders. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's what I'm saying. That's not music to me. That's more like work. That's more like I don't know, computer coding, or it's very left brain. The way that these games operate. I think that serves to just I don't know, demystify and degenerate the soul of what music is and what music means to culture and all of that. That's a whole other discussion altogether. But I see a definite trend between those two aspects of it. The whole idea.
It does sort of trivialize musical talent to a certain extent, because it creates this level playing field where anyone can get up and be a guitar hero.
Well, and it mechanizes it. It's all about mechanical. It's not about learning your own style and learning how to enjoy it. And I mean, of course, theory is always very important, and knowing how the whole theory of guitar and music works is very important. But this doesn't teach you any of that. It basically gives you this plastic thing, and you've just got to push the buttons at the right time, and that's it.
Well, it's a toy. It's a toy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You just push the buttons in at the right time, in time with one of your favorite rock songs. I mean, that's not music.
I don't know if we want to talk about it here, but this kind of brings up the point of arrested development, which is a topic of infinite fascination to me. I know that there've been but this is just another. I mean, I'm seeing it in so many areas. Just this fact that arrested development seems to be a growing thing, I would argue.
Well, I think You could say Arrested Development, or you could just say the absolute insane promotion of what you might call a youth cult or youth culture toward older demographics.
Yeah.
I mean, I notice it in my own neighborhood. I notice it when I'm walking around in the city that I live in. I see people who are in their 40s and 50s dressed like they're in their late teens and listening to music that 12-year-old girls would listen to.
That's called a midlife crisis.
Well, not just that. This is everybody. This is a whole. It's like everybody's into the same stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody's into the youth culture stuff. Everybody's into happy-go-lucky pop music. And everyone's into dressing up and going out and getting drunk, and everyone's into that whole sort of teenage culture. And regardless of their age. So whether you want to call it Arrested Development, I think that's definitely a part of it, but it's also the promotion of youth as being absolutely I don't know how you want to describe it.
It's promoting and encouraging Arrested Development.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that could be. Yeah, that's definitely a valid way of describing the phenomenon. Definitely, yeah, yeah.
I do think one thing I agree with what both of you are saying, but to kind of bolt something onto that, you've got to remember we're adults now, so we would see it in those terms. Whereas I think if you asked a 12, 13-year-old, they'd be desperately trying to become an adult. I think what we're actually seeing is everyone rushing towards the same ground. Everyone's competing for the same things, and it doesn't matter whether you're 12 years old or you're 40 years old or you're 60 years old. You're all supposed to be competing in the same way and trying to be the same things. And so obviously we as adults would see it as infantilization, and we'd think, we're all in whatever, our early 30s, so we're all thinking, aren't we all getting a bit too fucking old for this stuff? So we would talk about it in terms of Arrested Development, and that's absolutely accurate. But you get the point that I'm making, that now you've got, a 16-year-old girl going out to a nightclub with her 40-year-old mother, and they're both going after the same guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what we're
talking about.
So on the opposite end, we have the children growing up too fast. If you want to put
the children growing up too fast, and the adults trying to become youths again.
Or never leaving that adolescent period.
Or never ever leaving it.
You rush to adolescence and then try and stay there for 50 years. That seems to be
you get to 18 basically as a male, and like in terms of your emotional development, and you just basically stay at that level for the rest of your life, where it's just about fun and video games and fast cars and bikini girls and and beer and football and just having a yarn with the lads, and that's it, and all of your responsibilities is just a burden, it's just something you moan about, and this
Now it would make sense that if this is the sort of common playing field that we're all at, this is sort of the frame of mind we're all in, that we would not be able to understand or point out any sort of real issues that might be popping out, like addiction. We might not recognize addiction because I don't think an adolescent really can understand what addiction is. It's certainly not in an adult sort of way.
Well, I don't think they have the perspective on the long-term life. They haven't lived long enough to understand this is something that could actually come to dominate my entire life, which is what addiction is. So I don't think you're right. I don't think they could have that perspective. Sorry, Adam, go on.
Sorry to interrupt. And they've never had the withdrawal, so they don't know it's an addiction because it's always been there. It's been there since they've, especially for younger and younger generations, it's been there since day one. They've had some kind of a computer, a tablet, or something, or a cell phone since absolute day one, and they've never ever been without it. So they didn't even realize it's an addiction. I'm sure. This one of these things that comes up in some of these YouTube clips and these mini documentaries is when the parent will try and take the mobile phone or the computer or the laptop away from a child who has literally grown up with it since day one. They freak out. They absolutely freak out.
Violence. Act violently. They go into
withdrawal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, violent withdrawal.
And there's a couple examples from these videos that you recommended, Adam, where there's usually a young boy and he's playing his World of Warcraft or what have you. It's taken away or it's somehow interfered with at some moment by the mother, typically, and the boy reacts violently even to his mother.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, he was, in one of those videos, he was just saying, he was just screaming at her and calling her a bitch and telling her to fuck off and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I was like, whoa.
And
really
again,
intense.
to me, I have to play devil's advocate or whatever you want to call it here, that these videos, every one of them does seem staged to me. However, I'm not saying that that is the case. It just kind of feels that way. However, the point is that that's a real phenomenon. And even as a man, as a male, I kind of can relate to that sort of darkness. And I understand that as like kind of a dark element within men and within boys. Like that's just kind of something that we can fall into at our darkest point, is that sort of violent reactionary behavior. So it's a real phenomenon.
Of course, we all have that seed of darkness within us. We all have a shadow personality. Absolutely. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. But whether these particular videos, are staged or exaggerated, or sort of somewhere in the middle, or whatever, this kind of stuff is happening, and I can attest to that myself, through my own experiences and my own direct observations. So it's a very real phenomenon,
Well, one thing that occurred to me in one of those videos that you sent out, Adam, where the lad is sat playing World of Warcraft, and his mum isn't even trying to get him off the computer or take his computer away or anything. She's just trying to enter his room and say something, interact with him in some way. And that's
like, dinner's ready or something. Yeah,
it could be something completely ordinary and domestic and trivial.
Yeah.
It's not like there's even a confrontation going on, but he's responding antagonistically and aggressively and confrontationally. And what struck me was that, assuming this clip is real, or that this actually really happens regardless of whether the clip is or not, is that what seems to be being it's that she's interrupting his private imaginative process. He's there locked away in his little game, thinking he's whatever it is that he thinks he is in this game. And she's interrupting that. She's reminding him of the real world where he isn't that. He's just a kid playing a computer game. And that reminder, without actually coming in and saying it to him, or just by opening the door and saying something, she is reminding him of that. And that is painful for him, because then he's got to confront the reality again that he's just a kid sat there playing on a computer, rather than whatever this romantic fantasy is that he's got going on in his head.
Yeah, it's like a sudden big come down or something, back to reality, like boom, and I mean, no wonder anyone who's addicted is going to react badly to that.
Exactly. Yeah. What does an addict do when you confront them? If for God forbid you say, "Hey, you have a problem," they deny it, right?
Yeah, of course they deny it, and of course, they always say the first step to overcoming addiction is to actually admit that you're addicted to something, and these people, for the most part, are unable to, because the tools and the public dialogue and the sort of general discourse in the society on these issues is so scant in terms of its critical aspects. It's all just just corporate press releases and corporate sponsored think tank studies that all conclude that video games are great.
And it's also, I think it's also a question of motive, is it not? That if you have the motive,
Absolutely.
I mean, you're given a choice between, okay, you can remain in this idealistic, romanticized fantasy world where you can believe you are whatever you want to be, or the alternative is you confront that you've got a computer games addiction and that your life is actually rather sad and going in the wrong direction. What are you motivated to choose? Why would you have a reason, unless you had a particular inner strength, to choose the harder path, the path of greater resistance? Most people are going to choose the path of least resistance. Of course they are.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Especially children who don't have any real concept of some of those, of making wise choices for their own benefit in the long term. I mean, that's what parents are for, is to try and guide children through those experiences and help them give, the benefit of, give them the benefit of experience, But, for these children who become so immensely immersed and addicted to these games, any kind of intervention or guidance is immediately rejected, and often, as we were discussing, in a violent, aggressive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that addiction, just in general, I mean, it's misunderstood, and there's a depth to the misunderstanding as well. It comes down to the way we kind of approach everything, and that's a long conversation too. But we tend to think of addiction as in the physical sense. So there is a controlled substance, and that is what chemically addicts you. And I think we're still in that sort of generic framework. We don't understand completely mental psychological addiction. That's with beyond our framework that we're framing addiction in.
So you're addicted to the flashing lights rather than being addicted to heroin. I mean, it's the same thing, but you're right. We don't understand the addiction to flashing lights anywhere near as well.
No.
The same thing with television. Television is just as much an addiction.
Yeah.
Television is probably a larger addiction than video games for the most part, because it spans all generations. Right from age 5 up to basically death. So I mean, it's one of those things that for the generation that is even in their sort of later years now, that have still grown up with television all their lives. Their entire lifetime, so that is just another example of an addiction that is not talked about because it's just taken for granted. It's just something. It's like it's almost the television has become almost like the proverbial fifth member of the household. It's the God box in the room. It's something which people have. It has become part of the environment. And so people don't question it simply for that reason. And I mean, if you look at, B.F. Skinner's work on behavioral conditioning and operant conditioning, all the rest of it, he says, once you introduce something into an environment, it actually, the individual, the creature will adapt, and simply begin to accept it. They won't question it after a certain period of time, they just take it for granted. And the television is a perfect example of that. And I think probably a greater addiction to video games. But, along the same line, video games are addictive for the same reasons, that it's something that has been around for at least, a good, 2 or 3 generations now, and so because it's been around for so long and it's been part of people's lives for so long and has had so little research or critical analysis done into it, it's just one of those things that is generally accepted. And so the whole concept of video games or television being addictive is just it's out of the question. It's never even being really considered by most people, because they've just grown up with it. It's not something that's been introduced into their lives and has made them think or has, changed their lives dramatically in one way. It's something that's just always been there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've just crashed into a wall.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We should probably start wrapping this up now, but I'd like to return to the question that you raised earlier, Aaron, that what is it that we can do about this? Because, I mean, we've spoken for 2 hours on the problem in quite a lot of depth, I think, and I think anyone listening to this will go away with a relatively well-rounded view of what the problems are of technological addiction and computer games addiction and computer games in a more general sense. I think they'll get a pretty good going over for that. But like I say, the question is, what can we do about this? And so I'm going to throw out there what I said before. The thing that I think would be most effective and is most effective when I have actually raised this with friends and other people I know is to remind them of what they're sacrificing, is to point out that, if when they go home they are looking at their Facebook page on their phone more often than they're looking at their wife, their husband, their child, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
That is something they've lost. That is something that isn't good for them. That isn't good for their life and isn't good for their husband, wife, family, child, whatever. And so,
or themselves.
Or themselves, yeah. And so if you frame it in that way, I think you can get through to people far more than if you, to be honest, than if you start talking about the Pentagon and spying and all of that.
Yeah, and to bring it back to an adolescent boy perspective, you can say, hey, you're not going to get girls if you do this.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It is true.
It is, yeah.
There are, of course, TV shows like The Big Bang Theory trying to convince you otherwise, but...
Of course, yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, The Big Bang Theory. Oh, my God. I don't know where we started.
We're going to fall down another rabbit hole if we don't watch it.
Yeah, sorry, I probably shouldn't have brought it up. But yeah, if you have any sort of different things to suggest as constructive solutions to this, or at least attempts at constructive solutions to this, or anything to add on?
I guess I could probably, just throw in my own generalized view on this whole thing. I mean, I don't have any real. I mean, I think your approach. I think there's definitely validity to that. I think that there are also possible, not negative connotations, but there's possible. The reaction amongst certain demographics to that argument, I don't think would necessarily go down well. I think I think you'd have to have a person who was already, I don't know, cognizant in some way of the fact that, cognizant of what was going on in some way before they could take that information on. Because, I mean, I've tried to sort of have this type of conversation with people before, just the sort of Joe average blue-collar worker on the street, and they'll agree with you, and they'll sort of say, oh, yeah, it's true, we really are, and, this sort of, they'll appear to agree, but I can see that it's not sinking in. I can see that they're just going to go home and play their video game and just go, oh, fuck it, who cares, So I don't know. I think there's many different solutions depending on what the demographic is and what the situation is. So I don't know how I'm going to put that across, or. And I'm not saying I disagree with you, Tom. I just think that I think that there's different
strokes for different folks.
Exactly. Yeah. Just I think depending on the demographic and the individual and the personality type and how sort of what their lifestyle's like. I think it would depend on that.
Yeah.
I think people who are more, I don't know, as I said, cognizant of what's going on in terms of geopolitics or whatever, or pay more attention to current events, slightly more sort of intellectually active would respond better to an argument that Tom outlined, rather than the average Joe worker who just sort of plays video games without thinking. He's going to agree. I think he's going to agree with you, but it's not going to sink in. He's just going to say, well, that's just one guy's opinion. I haven't heard it on the news. Until the government or some corporation puts out a press release saying that video games are bad, I'm just going to assume that they're good.
Well, it's the individual versus the collective, as always. Yeah. We always come back to this.
Exactly, yeah.
Is the individual person able to find the gumption within themselves to overcome the collective, the enticements of the collective, of all the consensus reality, all the things that are thrown out there to pull you into whatever's being promoted en masse? Is the individual person able to recognize those things and say, okay, I see them for what they are. I am going to overcome them because it's worthwhile to do so. So I guess this is the real issue in this and in anything, is the individual person able to make that first step. And I think when you're able to overcome, I think you'd be able to overcome any addiction. I'm going out on a limb and saying that, but I really do believe that, and mind over matter principle I subscribe to personally. I mean, it's a reality, and I don't think we understand the power of that. So I would just encourage people to try to find it in themselves to make that first step, and when you do, you will start seeing the world for what it is and all the nonsense that's tossed our way, but you will easily overcome all of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I don't think that it's going to work for everyone. I think there's always going to be a demographic or a subculture out there who are always going to be into the stuff no matter what. Especially people who have bought into the whole transhuman idea and all of those types of different ideologies. I think there's always going to be some kind of demographic, however large it is. Some kind of subculture who will always buy into this stuff and who will quite happily, live in the world of video games and exist there forever.
And maybe it was wrong of me to say that it would be easy to overcome the collective enticements and all the bad things, as it were. I guess it's actually quite hard to do, but it's not impossible.
It's not impossible. It's not impossible. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And that's the main point to make here, is that it is possible, and if people can become cognizant of what's really, really going on and can think critically about, the impact that these things are having on their lives, then, we may begin to see some progress in terms of people looking at this whole issue from a different angle and, being honest with themselves in terms of, again, how video games have shaped their own lives and their convictions and their habits and all the rest of it. But, again, I think, this is not something that we can't win over everybody on this argument, is basically what I'm saying. I think there's always going to be a crowd who will go along with this stuff to the bitter end and will swallow the pill and will, basically, we'll be quite happy to, reside in the matrix as some kind of non-corporeal consciousness in a computer program. I think there's always going to be that demographic out there, but for the average person, for the type of person who's listening, or for the type of person who's listening to this show, who maybe has that innate ability to look at things critically and look at themselves more than anything else, I think that there is there's definitely hope there, for them to be able to do that, to really give themselves an honest assessment of what's really going on here, and have a serious a serious rethink about their convictions and their habits, regarding the whole digital world, the social media and video games and all the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a certain group of people that probably can't be helped here, to be honest, but there's an awful lot of people who can be. So hopefully we can finish on an optimistic note there. But I think we should probably wrap this up here. So should we just quickly throw out our websites again? I'm Tom Secker. My main website for this sort of stuff is spyculture.com. Adam?
Yep, and from cerebralrevolt.com. Once again, as I said in the interview, it's still being built, so there's not much there. But if people want to bookmark that and check back, and a month or two, I'm hoping to have it up by sort of, in a functioning state by the end of January, beginning of February, and a YouTube channel to go along with that as well. In the meantime, most of the stuff I do can be either found on, Aaron's website, Tom's website, or Thomas Schroeder's website, and a few other places as well, such as the Glasgow Truth Group meetup forum. So, yeah,
and I am Aaron Franz. My website is ageoftransitions.com. Check it out.
Okay, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening and thank both of you two for taking part in this roundtable. I think it's gone well.
Yeah, it's been a fun conversation.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure listeners will as well.
Yeah, I hope people have got something out of this, and I hope that we've had some kind of positive impact, whatever that impact may be.
As I can all the time, and if I'm not playing, I'm usually thinking, dreaming about it, looking at my stats in school, showing it to my friends, telling them my guild stories,
Well, virtual reality, you can be who you want to be, and you can be where you want to be, and with whom you want to be.
Physically pull myself away from the console.
Okay, we're away.
Yeah.
So
here we are.
Yeah, well, welcome to both of you. It's great to talk to both of you about this. I'm glad you both agreed to do this. I know this was kind of my idea, but it's all three of us sat here talking. So, Adam, Aaron, great to be talking to you both again.
Yeah, it's good. It's nice that we're all talking in the same place at the same time as well. It's believe the first time we've all had a discussion like this together. So, yeah,
it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, lots to talk about. But so, I mean, what if we'd like to tell the audience what it is we're going to be discussing today?
Well, okay. I mean, this all kicked off because I initially suggested doing a roundtable discussion, and it was all about this story about the British film director Duncan Jones, also known as Zowie Bowie, or Zoe Bowie, David Bowie's son, who has recently signed on to make a film version of the computer game World of Warcraft. And we kind of were bouncing emails back and forth about computer games, films, associated stuff, and so we thought, let's just have a roundtable discussion and invite everyone else in on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I mean, I personally haven't played a lot of video games personally, but I've done a fair bit of research into video games, in the background of video games, and things like that. I mean, I think you guys would probably, Tom, I think you said that there was a game that you were quite into for a while.
I am a bit of a gamer, or at least I have been in the past.
Right.
Gamer, to be honest, as an adolescent, I certainly had games consoles and played computer games a fair bit. Wasted, a reasonable amount of my teenage years doing that.
Yeah, I'm in that same boat, but I'd say I was even younger. I'd say like middle school to high school age. I was to video games pretty heavy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I probably a bit different. I played like the Sega Master System 2 when I was young. I think it was about like 6, 7 to maybe 10, 11, 12 at the very latest. And then I remember the PlayStation came out, and there was like Gran Turismo, but I never really owned the only console I ever owned was just the Sega, and I never took it any further than that. Any other experience in video games has just been casual here and there. Maybe a friend's got a console type thing. Apart from one other experience that I did have, where I got into a particular video game a few years ago and found the experience to be highly disturbing, which I'll get into later on. Disorder to people with attention deficit disorder, which is completely seems counterintuitive, because I think video games are more responsible for causing.
Increase that.
Yeah, that's basically that. And the impression one would get if one was to do a Google search, on these types of subjects, is that basically video games are actually quite good for you psychologically, and.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've come across these things. Yeah, and then the general idea is that yes, they're good. They're not bad, and you would think buried in there somewhere, or at least it should actually be on the top, that we'd have an issue with video games causing problems with addiction, because clearly they are very addictive.
I think as computer games have got more sophisticated, as the environments that people are playing in have become more sophisticated and more immersive, and you can do more things in them, that has only made them more and more addictive, because they provide you with sort of even more than just, you're not just kind of playing football on a football pitch or basketball or whatever, skating around or something. You're, in effect, living an entire life within the game. And this is particularly true, as you were telling me, with World of Warcraft, which is not a game I'm particularly familiar with, but I've kind of been learning a bit about it as we've been chatting about it. So yeah, I think the fact that this guy Duncan Jones is making a film about this doesn't strike me as a coincidence, shall we say? Yeah,
that's I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon, the whole World of Warcraft thing. And as I said before, I've never personally played it myself, although I have seen other people play it, and I've seen the addictive effects and the consequences of addiction on people that I've known, and it's been quite scary, actually. I've seen people quit their jobs, become, start eating, way too much and becoming really unhealthy to the point of hospitalization, and complete depression, complete social isolation, I mean, it's always, of course, whenever the media does any type of focus on World of Warcraft and stuff, they predominantly at least tend to focus on all the positive aspects, and how, look at this couple, they met through World of Warcraft and end up getting married, and and look at all these happy people at the gaming convention centers, and they're all playing together, and they're all meeting people who they've known online for years, and they feel as if they're closer they're closer to these people than they are to their family, and look at all the great things that World of Warcraft has done. done for people on a social level. That tends to be the predominant conclusion that's drawn from so many of these media articles and documentaries and whatnot, and it sort of ties back to what I was saying before about if someone were to do a Google search on the different studies that have been done on the psychological effect of video games, they're predominantly presented as being positive. They're predominantly be presented as being something that's good for you, basically good for your brain, good for your relationships, good for you socially, good for you, and in so many other ways. So yeah,
it's funny you're saying that if you really get into the World of Warcraft and you become addictive, you become socially isolated. But the argument against that and for World of Warcraft being good would be, hey, look, it's an online community and people do interact with each other. They can chat and you're actually interacting with the other players. So it.
So I probably have less experience than both of you in terms of actually playing video games, but I've done a lot of research into the background of video games. So yeah.
So what do you make of this guy, either of you, this guy Duncan Jones? Because I think, his two previous big films that we know about were Moon, which was 2009, and Source Code, which is, well, they're both films with an awful lot of ideas going on in them, and not particularly pleasant ideas, I'd say, in either of them. So either one of you want to jump in on the films that he's made before?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'll talk about Moon real quick. It was basically just about cloning, and it was an exploration of some of the downfalls of cloning. And that was, if we want to break down the movie as quick as we can, I guess that would be it, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's about a guy working on the moon to he's extracting fuel from the surface of the moon and kind of
he's strip mining the whole moon, basically.
Yeah, and posting it back to Earth, and then he discovers, as the film progresses, that he's in fact a clone, and he's whatever the 20 iteration of this same person working on their own on the moon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's basically it. That's the story. That's right there. That's the whole film, basically. But yeah, it's still very, very important themes, though. Yeah, and of course, what was the other one that you mentioned?
Source Code.
Source Code. Yeah, that is another very interesting film dealing with a lot of interesting concepts, especially relating to the military-industrial complex and their, shall we say, experiments into. Well, I mean, this whole film was based around the experiments into quantum physics, basically, and I mean, it's kind of a complex. Well, not overly complex, but one would have to watch the film, and I'd be going off on a tangent if I were to explain the entire, sort of plot of the film right now.
No, sure. I think for this particular conversation, the important bit about that film is that it kind of portrays the military-industrial complex as effectively omniscient. They can find out almost anything they want, even if it means kind of injecting one person's consciousness into another dead person's consciousness just before they get killed, or whatever the hell it is that they're actually supposedly doing in this film. Yeah. But that's the idea, I think.
And of course, it's necessary too, because they're preventing a terrorist plot, a terrorist bomb, and a dirty nuclear bomb from blowing up Chicago. So we've got to have these programs. We've got to keep you all safe. Mm-hmm. So yeah, of course.
Yeah, so they're sort of acting like God, but at the same time they're doing so in everybody's best interest. So they're a benevolent God.
And that's why they're mixing people's consciousness together and stealing other people's identities and so on through quantum physics. Yeah, it's all for our own good.
Yeah, it's all for our own good, of course. Everything's always for our own good, including video games, apparently. Because if you actually do, if you do a Google search, for example, just take some keywords like video games, mental health, depression, addiction, things like that. If you just do sort of random Google search on those sort of key combinations of words, and basically looking at the negative impacts of video games, what you'll find is just basically a whole bunch of studies that talk about how great video games are and how video games can help you, and video games have been helping to treat everything from troops suffering from post-traumatic stress.
It does a good job of simulating a real life social environment, and it becomes an alternative to a real life social environment. And people, for whatever reason, like the addictive quality of video games added onto that, it becomes better for certain people, and that's why they end up spending all their time in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, though, the important question that's always running through my mind with that one is which is cause and which is effect. Is it that the person was tending towards social isolation and therefore looking for some other social platform to be a part of, and therefore turned to World of Warcraft or Facebook or one of the other slightly more, shall we say, basic forms of online communities? Or is it that because they got involved with that, they became more socially isolated? And I think it will tend to be, not always, but it will tend to be people who were already somewhat isolated, somewhat socially dysfunctional, or just not that good at, socializing with other people, and therefore they were looking for another forum. And because they found this one, and because in this they could kind of pretend that they were whatever they wanted to be, and they could tell anyone else anything that they wanted them to hear, that's much easier. So that then isolates them yet further. That's probably the trajectory, I think, of most people who get involved with this, would you say? I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing here.
I think you're probably right. I think it's probably a degree of that, definitely. I mean, people of that type of, shall we say, socially, maladjusted personality types are always going to be prone towards, looking for other solutions or alternatives, in the form of virtual worlds and virtual environments and, social media platforms like Facebook and, multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft and things like that. So I think that's definitely going to be true to a degree. But I think the question you were sort of raising before is, which one is the how should I put it, the predominant factor here? I think both of them feed back into each other. I think one will feed the other. I think the more this whole community and the more this whole phenomenon grows, the more it will draw people who might not otherwise have been drawn into it in. So
that's what the hope is too for virtual worlds, just in general. That all the promoters for them, the Carswells, the Matteo Keikes, all these guys, they're like, oh yeah, everybody's just gonna be living in these things in 20 years' time. So, of course we can analyze who's using them now, and it's sort of a more extreme sort of person, I guess we'll just say. But the idea is for everybody to be in these things.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that opens up a whole other can of worms. Well, a whole other side to the which is the history of video games, and their tie into the whole military-industrial intelligence complex. And there are so many different references and facts to look at in that area. But I think it would probably be good to look at those later on, in the conversation, because it'd be nice to discuss the social phenomenon, or to look at this as a social phenomenon, at least in the earlier parts of the discussion, and why it's become so popular and what types of effects it's having on the society around us.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Let's loop back to that a bit later on. But I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Aaron, when you say that the aim here is that this is for everyone, not just because of statements by Kurzweil and films like The Matrix and what have you, promoting, the digital identity and digital reality and us all living as part of some kind of computer or whatever. But in particular, that we have this computer game being made into a presumably quite high-budget, popular film.
Yeah.
That is a big red flag to me. This is one of the reasons why this news story kind of jumped out at me, was I was thinking most computer game to film conversions, adaptations, have been terrible, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like Mortal Kombat, yeah.
And Mario Brothers is awful.
Street Fighter, yeah, pretty much all of them have been awful movies, and most of them haven't done well at the box office either. So it's not like this is a project that, or a genre of movie that's been very successful, yet they seem to be determined to stick with it. So why are they sticking with it, and why in particular have they moved on from something like Street Fighter, which has a relatively, or Mario Brothers, which has a relatively straightforward movie format? You have your heroes and you have a scenario that they have to somehow resolve or whatever. I mean, how on earth are they going to make a film about World of Warcraft?
I imagine something akin to Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like what the World of Warcraft setting is in a way. They take all the same fantasy type themes. Dragons and witches and monsters and demons and all that kind of stuff. And the World of Warcraft settings. I mean, there's a number of different worlds you can go into in that, or parts of of an environment you can go into, but they all sort of resemble that sort of almost Tolkien-like, environment. So there's definitely a close relationship between the two. And I don't know enough about this new project with Duncan Jones, but I'd imagine, rather than it being, sort of a real story about a man who starts playing World of Warcraft, it's going to be, like a fictional retelling of an actual story within that environment,
Mm-hmm. And if the movie's good enough, it will get attention to the game itself and get more people interested in that. Yeah.
So you're saying this is all set in a essentially medieval setting?
Well, a fantastical medieval setting is so with fantasy. It's like the what is that TV show, the Game of Thrones? You're watching it. It's almost like it's a period piece for the medieval times, and then they throw in a dragon baby. And it's like, okay, there's dragon babies here now. Whatever.
Yeah, it's sort of like Lord of the Rings kind of meets Harry Potter meets, like pretty much every other fantasy type, genre or, drama series, out there. Really, it's sort of like an amalgamation of all the key fantasy themes, wizards and witches and, monsters and demons and dragons and kings and kingdoms and warriors and, all that type of stuff. Yeah. So as I said, I haven't actually played the game, but I have seen, a lot of gameplay and I've looked into it. So it's definitely very much akin to things like Lord of the Rings, which has been, immensely popular, especially the films,
Well, that's what's so interesting to me about this, is that